to the 360.
It's torture.
Her self-esteem is in the toilet.
And then...
Shut up! You have your own show!
The queen of fashion is now the queen of late-night talk.
Great fashion, great celebrity guests, and all done in a whole new way.
A sneak peek of the hot new show, Shut Up, It's Stacey London. Friday at 9 on TLC.
July 1993. It seemed like everyone in Coffee County, Kansas had turned out for the county fair.
It's a good time. We're having fun, just kicking back.
Randy Holtz worked as a local EMT. He was also a veteran skydiver with nearly 1,000 jumps under his chute. Randy and a group of friends were preparing to put on an exhibition for the awaiting crowd. After the jumpers had completed their formation, they separated and headed for a landing field at the fairgrounds. Randy was the first one in. Then, suddenly, it looked like he was in trouble.
From my vantage point, he had sailed right toward the grandstand. I thought, man, he's going too fast. He's going to hit the grandstand.
Randy's chute had hit unexpected wind shear, literally knocking the wind out of it, sending him hurtling straight toward the crowd below.
Somehow he got the thing turned around, and he was going due south. Well, that was right at the bleachers with a bunch of spectators there, a bunch of little ones sitting up front. I knew he was going way too fast, and I thought, oh, this isn't good. And I saw the chute just rotate up, and then he just hit the ground. I heard him hit the ground. I could hear the crowd scream, and I knew he was in trouble. I asked my partner to go get the truck, and I took off running towards his location.
No, he just hit the ground.
Damien had no idea what he'd find when he reached his longtime friend and fellow EMT.
He was bleeding from the ears, bleeding from the nose. Anytime you have blood from the ears, you can pretty well be assured you have a skull fracture. There weren't palpable pulses. We just couldn't get a blood pressure, and we're pushing fluid into him as quick as we could do it.
Randy had also suffered severe fractures to his right leg and pelvis, but no one would know the extent of the damage until they got him to a hospital. Still, Damien was not holding on to false hope.
Seriously, I thought he was all done.
Randy was rushed to Coffee County, stabilized, and immediately transferred by helicopter.
Since he was so critical, we decided to hot load, where they keep the blades turning. They don't shut down, they set down. You transfer the patient from our crew to theirs, and up and gone.
Randy arrived at St. Francis Medical Center in Topeka just 75 minutes after he'd hit the ground. Dr. Phillip Baker headed the surgical team that met Randy in the emergency room.
He was unconscious, his face was quite injured, and he had an open fracture with the right femur looking right at me. As I walked through the door, I'll remember it, there was a hole through the side of his thigh, and on the end of his thigh bone, his femur, was about a golf ball-sized ball of mud and blood stuck to the bone.
8 physicians began working on what would be the first of several procedures Randy would endure over the next week to fix fractures to his face, mouth, hip, pelvis, spine, arm, and feet.
And he was then moved from the operating room and transferred in traction into the intensive care at the hospital.
And that's where Randy would stay, in a medically induced coma and in traction.
We did use drugs to keep him sedated because as soon as Randy would wake up a little bit, he was always moving his fractures. His feet were always wanting to be pointed down to the foot of the bed, and so we put casts on his lower legs and just kept him that way for about 3 weeks.
And every few days, doctors would bring Randy back into the OR for another procedure.
We did tracheostomy, open fracture femur care. A piece of the bone had actually come out of his leg. Then we had to go back and clean the leg again, put a traction pin in as another surgery. He had wires out of his face. hip fracture, elbow fracture repair, and a pinning of some bones.
Finally, after 3 weeks in a coma,
As the days passed, we could tell that he was a little less comatose. And he finally woke up enough he could begin to talk a bit, but he didn't make much sense and certainly didn't remember anything short term. You'd ask him something and go away and come back, and that answer was gone, and you'd have something else.
Randy does remember that the first person he saw when he woke up was a nurse named Eric.
And I grabbed his shirt and I pulled him down to my face and I said, "It was skydiving, wasn't it?" And he looked at me and he said, "Yeah." And the next thing I asked him was, "Why am I still alive? Why am I not dead?" And he looked at me and he said, "Nobody knows."
And few people could imagine the kind of pain Randy was feeling.
After up and I was in all that traction, I lived with pain, at least on a 10 scale, for a long time. I got to where I lived with pain so much, I actually got used to it. And since then, I've developed a real high pain tolerance. It takes a lot before I'll complain about it.
After nearly 2 months at St. Francis, Randy was transferred to a rehab hospital, where he was told he'd spend another 8 weeks.
I looked at her and I said, "No, I'll be out of here in 2. And she said, "No, you're a minimum of 8 weeks." And I said, "No, watch me." I started working as hard as I could, and almost 2 weeks to the day I walked out of there on a cane, which surprised everybody.
What doesn't surprise anyone who knows Randy is his mid-air decision.
I looked, and the last thing I remember was seeing these kids. I was headed right for these kids. And one of them was my friend's kid, and I was looking him right in the eye. And I thought, God, if I hit these kids, I'll kill them. And I remember turning real sharp to try to miss them and trying to shunt my body away from them. And I looked at the ground, and it was coming up, they estimated 40 to 60 miles an hour, and the last thing that went through my mind was, God, I'm dead. And that's the last thing I remember about it, till I woke up in the hospital.
Today, Randy is back on the job he loves, working as an EMT.
I can look at a lot of those people that have been victims of trauma, and I can tell them, I've been in your shoes.
Since the accident, Randy has also had another reason to celebrate.
I was the best man in his wedding a few years back, so that was a lot of fun, and I had a big dance afterwards.
The man who was told he'd never walk again was dancing at his own wedding. Of course, that's only a surprise to anyone who didn't know Randy Holtz before.
Right now, I'm just happy. I'm happy to be here.
And for good measure, since his recovery, Randy's made over 50 more successful jumps.
It's not over till you say it's over.
Coming up, how does this feline feel about becoming an outdoor cat? Let's just say she's on the fence about it.